Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is February 4th. On this day in 1999, a tragedy unfolded in Bronx, New York that would spark nationwide outrage. Amadou Diallo, a 23-year-old immigrant from Guinea, was shot and killed by 4 plainclothes police officers outside of his apartment building. The officers fired 41 shots in just a few seconds, hitting him 19 times. They later claimed that they believed he was armed, but Amadou had no weapons on him, only his wallet. His death became a rallying cry for police accountability and racial justice. Today, we'll explore Amadou's life, the events of that fateful night, and the lasting impact that this case has had more than 2 decades later. Let's get started. Amadou Diallo was born on September 2nd, 1975 in Liberia, but his roots were in Guinea. His parents, Saikou and Kadiatou Diallo, valued education, hard work, and family above all else. Because of his father's business ventures, Amadou spent most of his childhood moving between countries, living in places like Togo, Thailand, and Guinea. Amadou was ambitious, and by 1996 he had made his way to New York City. He dreamed of earning a college degree in either business or computer science and eventually returning home to build a better future. To support himself in New York, he worked as a street vendor, selling gloves, socks, and videotapes in Manhattan. Those who knew him described him as quiet and kind. His mother, Kadiatou, later said, quote, "Amadou was gentle and hardworking. He believed in the promise of America, the chance to make something of yourself." End quote. He lived in a small apartment on Wheeler Avenue in the Bronx and was focused on his goals and on his future. But his life was cut short in the most tragic and senseless way. Just after midnight on February 4th, 1999, Amadou Diallo stood outside of his apartment building, possibly taking in the cool air after a long day. At around 12:40 a.m., 4 plainclothes officers from NYPD's Street Crimes Unit, Sean Carroll, Edward McMillan, Kenneth Boss, and Richard Murphy, were patrolling the neighborhood. The unit had a reputation for being aggressive in its approach to stopping crime. In fact, its unofficial motto was, "We own the night," a phrase that would later come under pretty intense scrutiny. The officers later claimed that they saw Amadou standing in the vestibule of his building and thought he matched the description of a serial rapist that they were looking for. According to their testimony, they approached him, identified themselves as police, and asked him to show his hands. What happened next remains the subject of controversy. Amadou was probably startled and confused, so he reached into his pocket, probably to show identification. But in that split second, the officers claimed they believed he was reaching for a gun. They opened fire. In a matter of seconds, they shot 41 bullets, hitting him 19 times. The glass of the vestibule shattered as Amadou collapsed, bleeding out in the entryway of his own home. Neighbors were jolted awake by the sound of gunfire. Some rushed to their windows, horrified by the sheer number of shots. One witness later said, quote, "It sounded like a war zone. And then we saw him just lying there." End quote. The Bronx community was in shock. As news of the shooting spread, grief quickly turned to outrage all over the city. People demanded answers. How could an unarmed man standing outside of his own home be shot so many times? Residents accused the NYPD of racial profiling and excessive force and pointed out that Amadou's death was not an isolated case, but part of a broader pattern of police violence in Black and immigrant communities. Reverend Al Sharpton, who would later become a leading voice in the case, said at a vigil, quote, Amadou was guilty of nothing but standing in front of his house. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was an injustice, one rooted in the systemic dehumanization of Black men." End quote. Amadou's parents flew to New York from Guinea, heartbroken and searching for justice. His mother, Kadiatou, stood in front of cameras, her voice trembling as she said, quote, "My son came here for a better life. He didn't deserve to die like this. Alone, terrified, and misunderstood." End quote. The NYPD called the shooting a tragic mistake. Commissioner Howard Safir defended the officers, stating, quote, "These officers believed they were facing an armed suspect and acted accordingly." End quote. But the community wasn't convinced. The sheer number of bullets fired, 41 in total, became a powerful symbol of excessive force repeated at protests across the country. All 4 officers were charged with second-degree murder and reckless endangerment. However, before the trial even began, controversy erupted when it was moved from the Bronx to Albany, which is New York's capital, and that was a decision that frustrated activists who feared that a jury outside of the city would be less diverse and less sympathetic to Amadou's case. During the trial, the defense argued that the officers genuinely believed their lives were in danger. Defense attorney Stephen Worth said, quote, "This was a tragic misunderstanding. These officers reacted to what they thought was a gun. They had a split second to decide." End quote. Prosecutors counted that Amadou was unarmed and posed no threat. Prosecutor Eric Warner argued, quote, "This was not policing. This was a failure to value human life." End quote. The courtroom was filled with emotion, with Amadou's family sitting through painful testimony. His mother later wrote in her memoir, quote, "Sitting there, listening to my son's life reduced to a series of actions and arguments, it broke my heart over and over again." End quote. On February 25th, 2000, the jury acquitted the officers of all charges. The decision set off protests across the country. Demonstrators marched through New York chanting 41 shots as a reminder of the brutality that ended Amadou's life. Kadiatou Diallo spoke at a press conference after the verdict, saying, quote, "We came here for justice, but we were denied. But we will not stop fighting for change. Not for Amadou, not for the countless others." End quote. Amadou Diallo's death became a defining moment in the fight for police reform. Activists pushed for better training, increased accountability, and stronger measures to combat racial profiling. As a direct result of this public pressure, the Street Crimes Unit was disbanded in 2002. Reverend Al Sharpton later said, quote, "Amadou's death wasn't in vain. It forced a conversation this country needed to have, but the fight is far from over." End quote. Diallo's story resonated in the arts, with Bruce Springsteen's song American Skin, 41 Shots becoming an anthem for the movement. The lyrics captured the pain and fear felt by many. You can get killed just for living in your American skin. While the song faced backlash from police unions, it cemented Diallo's place in the broader fight for justice. Kadiatou Diallo channeled her grief into activism, founding the Amadou Diallo Foundation to promote social justice and education. In her memoir, My Heart Will Cross the Ocean, she wrote, quote, "Amadou's story is not just his own. It's the story of so many others, and it's a story we must never forget." End quote. Amadou Diallo's case remains a painful but necessary reminder of the need for justice and accountability in policing. We have come a long way since 1999, but we still have so much further to go. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform or on YouTube. And be sure to join me tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!